Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial. Today, we're going to be going over this. So this tutorial is going to be mainly focusing on tracking the web to your hand or to your web shooter, whichever you'll be using, and then doing the reactive physics for the web with the puppet tool. So if you just want to practice this effect, you can go ahead and download the footage I shot and follow along. There will be a link in the description below. One more thing before we jump into it, I just want to say thank you guys so much. I just passed 1,000 subscribers on the channel, so if you're not subscribed, be sure to do that. I got a lot more fun tutorials planned, so let's get right to it. Now, one thing I would really quickly like to add is that if you're coming directly from the previous tutorial, you're not interested in going through setting up the footage and tracking and figuring out how to get things ready, you just want to know how to set up the web in order to transfer the effect over to a web shooter with reactive physics, go ahead and skip to about 7.5 minutes into the tutorial. All right, so here we are in After Effects. As you can see, I got my footage imported, so I'm gonna go ahead and drag that down to this option here for a new composition. Then I'm gonna go forward to about the point when I'm going to move my hand into frame, about right here. Then you can hit Alt, open bracket to trim your footage, and then Alt, home to bring it to the beginning of your composition. Then I'm going to scrub forward to about where I want it to end. Here looks good. Alt, close bracket. Then you can hit N on the keyboard to trim your composition. Right click, trim comp to work area. The first step is to track the hand so that way the web knows what it is going to be sticking to. For my original example, I used the built-in Mocha tracker for After Effects. However, just for the sake of this tutorial, I will be staying all within After Effects. So pop open your tracker here on the right-hand side. If you don't see it, you can go to Window, down here at the bottom, find Tracker. So we need to find the moment when we want to begin our track. You can use page up and page down to scrub through your footage frame by frame. Right here looks good, the moment after the web would be coming out of the shooter. Make sure you have your footage selected, and then over here in the tracker window, click Track Motion. I'm gonna zoom in here. Let's make our track window a little bit bigger, as well as the search area. Now this track will be done in two separate stages. The first stage is the web shooter track, and the second stage is the hand track, as the web does transfer from the web shooter to the hand as I close my fist around it. So the first spot I will be tracking is just this corner of this dark area here, so right about there. And then I'm going to move forward to the next frame to make sure that we have it. There we go, looks good. So right here, when my fist will then be closed around it, I'm going to stop my track there. We're gonna go Layer, New, Null Object, click Edit Target and make sure your null is set to the default there. If it's not, click the down arrow and find it. Then click OK, Apply to X and Y. Now you can select your null and hit U on the keyboard. Go to the beginning when the keyframes start, hit Alt beginning bracket, go to the end, hit Alt end bracket, so that way you can just visually see where this first track starts and stops. It's not necessary, but I like to stay organized. Next, we're going to create another new null object. This one, we're going to go to the very first frame that we would be needing it, which is here. Select our footage again, click Track Motion. Same thing, expand our track and search areas. Next, all we need to do is determine what point on the hand we can track that won't leave frame or move around too much. If you were using Mocha, this would not matter as much because Mocha is really good at determining morph and when things leave frame for a little bit without messing up the track. However, here in After Effects, if you pick a point that leaves frame or changes, your track will be completely messed up.
You must choose. Choose wisely.
In the original, I'm fairly certain I used this dark point right here. So I'm going to move my tracker over right there and then hit track forward to the next frame. And I'm going to speed up this footage just a little bit until the track is finished. I've changed my mind. For the sake of tutorial, I'm just gonna make my comp 6 seconds long just to make it go quicker for all of us involved, so that's where my track will end. Now, usually in this instance where you have two different nulls with tracking data on them, you would just determine which one is the parent and which one is the child, and then parent the child to the parent. But in this instance, that's not going to work because we are going to be working with expressions. The position data has to be all on one single null. So in order to do that, you can hit P on the keyboard to open up the position data for both of the nulls, highlight all of the keyframes for your first null, and then choose Edit, Copy, or Control C, and then make sure your time code indicator here, this little blue thing, is on the first frame of your first tracking point here. Select your second null and hit Edit, Paste. Now you can delete your first null, and as you can see, the tracking data is all on one single null now, except there's one issue. The point right here jumps from the web shooter to the hand, and what we want to do is have it be a steady glide across, as if the web is being pulled from the web shooter to my fist as I close my hand around it. So the way to do that is to back up just a few frames to say about right here, and then on our next position keyframe, move our track point just a little bit closer to this dark area that we chose later here. Next frame, just a little bit closer, and then the frame after that, our next track is already engaged. So if you play that back, it's actually a smooth glide across the hand. Now this is something that's going to need to be refined for later, however, it'll work just fine for now. Now the next thing we're going to do is finally move on to creating our web. So we're going to go to Layer, New, Solid. I'm going to name this Element 3D just cause, and then we're going to go to Effect, Video Copilot, and then choose Element. Now over here in the project window, I have imported this panorama of my living room. So I'm going to drag this into a new composition. I'm going to change the comp to actually be quite a bit smaller, maybe something around 5,000 width and 3,000 height looks good to me. I'm gonna right click on the panorama and choose Transform, Fit to Comp. And now we're going to name this, how about Environment? Now back here over in our original composition, you can see that the wall is actually quite a bit warmer than it is in our environment. So in order to fix that, with our environment selected, we'll go Effect, Color Correction, Curves, go to the red channel, brighten it up some, go to the blue channel, darken it down, and that looks about good. It'll work for now. Back over into the original composition, select the project window, and then find our newly created environment composition, drop that in, and shut off its visibility because we don't need that. Inside of Element 3D, I'm going to go to the Custom Layers, Custom Texture Maps, and then select for Layer 1 our environment. Now in the scene setup, now here in Element 3D, I'm actually going to breeze through creating the web fairly quickly because I actually have a whole nother tutorial where I went into detail doing that. So if at any point in time you get lost or you want more information on creating it, go check that out. I will have it linked in the description below. But the first thing we're going to do is create a new cylinder. We're going to rotate the cylinder on its side here, 90 degrees, height segments up to 200. Radius down to 0.035, and the height up to 25. Gonna move it all the way to the right till about there. Change the anchor point. So that about does it for the web string. Over here in my models, I have this preset made for the web cone. I walked through making this and why you wanted to create it like this in the previous tutorial. However, if you're not interested in making one on your own, you're totally welcome to download this yourself. It will be in the download link along with the footage, which will be linked in the description below. I'm gonna rotate this 90 degrees, move it to the end, scale it down, stretch it out maybe a little bit. I also, in the original example, duplicated it and rotated it, pulled it back, and stretched it out a little bit more. Pretty much as complex as you're willing to make it, the better it will look. However, for this specific tutorial, we're not going to be focusing too much on the web because, like I said, there's another tutorial where I did that, so we're mainly going to be focusing on how to transfer the technique to coming out of a web shooter. Next, I'm going to click this button to create a new group folder and drag it out on its own. Change the group to Group 2, and then grab both of the web cylinder folders and move them into the Group 2 folder. Now we can click OK. Now the next thing we need to do is create a new camera. Click OK, 50mm is what I shot on. Then we're going to click and hold on the camera tool up here until we get the orbit camera tool. And we can change the perspective on the web until it about matches. That looks about good. Next, under Element 3D, for Group 1 and Group 2, we're going to find Create Group Null and create one for both Group 1 and Group 2. Select the group 2 null and parent it to group 1 because we don't want the web to go anywhere without the web cylinder attached to it at the end. Next, I think the web cylinder is actually a bit wide, so I'm going to hit S on the keyboard to bring up the scale, and then click this button here to unlink the constrain proportions, so that way we can individually change the X, Y, and Z scale. Now I'm going to leave this first value alone, but the second and third values I'm going to change both to about 60. That looks about good to me. I'm so sorry, there's actually two things I forgot to do inside of Element here real quick. So go back to the scene setup. Here over in the materials, click on physical and give our main cylinder the glass texture. Next, go to environment and select layer 1. Now we can click OK. All right, so now what we're going to do next is actually animate the web to shoot out as if it's coming out of the web shooter. So the way to do that is grab your group 1 null, hit S on the keyboard, again turn off the constrain proportions, this button here, and then we're going to change this first value here. So we're going to scrub to the point in frame when the web would be first coming out, so right here I'd say is good, and then click the stopwatch to create a keyframe. And then set the first value to 0, move forward maybe 3 frames, and then set the value to 100. Now, you can see there's an issue that it's flattening out the web cone, and we don't want that. So we need to go back to the scale of our group 2 null, so click that and hit S on the keyboard. And now click the stopwatch for that as well. Move that keyframe out to the end of the animation. And then for the beginning, we're going to set the scale for the second 2 values both to 0. So if we solo this and play it back, so as you can see, it needs a little bit of work. So the next step is for a little bit of compositing. So we're going to go into our Element 3D settings, toggle open our render settings, find ambient occlusion, turn that on. Next, I'd like to adjust our environment a touch. So we're going to go to the physical environment. Just so we can see it better, check this box that says Show in Background. Then we can open up Rotate Environment and change the Y rotation until the wall matches the same wall that we're currently on. So getting pretty close, just to refine what about it is that we're seeing in comparison to our scene. Now we can turn off our Show in Background. That looks good to me. Now, just like we did in the previous web effect tutorial, we're going to go to our Group 1 settings and toggle open our particle look and then our deform. Make sure enable is selected. Open up noise, click enable on that as well. And then we're going to change the intensity to about 0.5 and the scale up to about 600. Now I would like to add some depth of field. So toggle open our camera options here by clicking this down arrow. The depth of field option by default should be set to off, so click that once to turn it on. And it looks like the default is actually already pretty close to what we have in our scene. We want our focal point to be about where it was in our actual scene, which was set to about my wrist. So we can adjust our focal distance until that matches on our web fairly accurately. I'm actually, for the sake of this, going to leave it alone. My default value is at about 2600. However, you will need to adjust yours until about right here on the web is the sharpest point. However, one thing I am going to do is change our blur level up to about 150%, just to get our depth of field a little bit more dramatic as the web stretches down further into the scene. All right, we can close out of the camera settings. Next, I'm going to color correct the web just a touch before we move on. So select your Element 3D layer, and then up here go to Effect, Color Correction, and choose Curves. I want it to be a little bit brighter, so just pull up the middle here. Then let's see, maybe we can go to the red channel and drop that down just a touch. Go to the blue channel and add back in some blue values. There we go. If we zoom in here, we can see what we're doing a little bit better. It's already looking a lot better if we toggle this on and off, but I think it's a little green, so we're going to go to the green channel and pull that out just a touch. I am going to go back and refine this further later. However, I just wanted to get it started right now. Next, we're going to select our footage layer and then hit Control-D on the keyboard to duplicate it. Move it up above our tracked null here, mine's called null 5. And now holding Shift, select everything, including our group 1 and 2 nulls, and then choose Layer, Precompose. We're going to call this Web Comp, and then hit enter for OK. Now inside of our web comp, double click on it. We want to select our footage, right click on it, and then choose guide layer. What a guide layer does is it essentially just only has visibility inside of the comp that it exists in. So that way back here in our original comp we're working, if we solo our pre-composition, the footage does not show through, just the web. The next step is to go up here into our project panel, find our web comp that we created, and then hit Control-D on the keyboard to duplicate it. So now there are two instances of our web comp and web comp 2. We can double click web comp 2, right click on the composition tab and then choose composition settings, and I'm going to call this web cone. Now inside of our web cone comp, we're going to go to the element 3D scene setup and then turn off visibility for our group folder number 1 and then click OK. Now essentially what that just did is it soloed just our web cone here at the end. We're going to do the exact opposite in our original web comp. So back here into the element 3D scene setup, we're going to turn off visibility for group folder 2 to get rid of the web cone. Click OK. Now we can go back into our original composition we were working in. We already have web comp in here, but next we need to go to the project panel and drag in web cone as well. The reason we separated these out into two different individual layers is because the puppet tool is going to be applied to our web comp, but we do not want it to affect our cone at all. We don't want the cone warping around, as realistically it would be stuck to the wall. Now this is really where you're going to want to stay organized, maybe even more so than I am, because we're going to create another pre-composition of our original web comp here. So if you choose web comp, go layer, pre-compose, move all attributes, and I'll call this web comp 2. Click OK. Now if you double click and go into web comp 2, so this is where our physics is going to take place. I'm going to add a puppet tool to the beginning and end of this, and then according to where my hand is moving in the footage, we can adjust how the puppet tool is making this string react. However, I don't want to do that yet. First, I want to get our tracking underway. So back here into the main composition, we can select our web cone and web comp together by holding Shift. Let's move them closer to where they will come out of the web shooter. There, looks good. Now with web comp selected, we can go up to the puppet tool and then create a point at the beginning and then one at the very end of this web. Now we can click web comp 2 and then hit U on the keyboard to bring up the puppet tool pins. You can turn off the stopwatch for both of them. It's not necessary to have them keyframed for now. Now puppet pin 1 is the one that is going to be parented to our null. And the way to do that is to select our null and hit P on the keyboard. Now for puppet pin 1, alt-click on the stopwatch and then pick whip with this function here the position of puppet pin 1 to the position of null 5. And then click anywhere in here to close out. Okay, good. I'm actually glad I ran into this issue. This can be caused by a number of things, like the anchor point being off or just the position information between compositions not lining up. However, if you run into the issue here where even though the puppet pin 1 is directly copying the position information from null, the point is up somewhere random in the composition, you can fix it fairly easily. All you need to do is click back into the expression down here for transform and position, and then add a simple plus, open bracket, and then this is kind of a guess and check type game. I know that I want it to move down and to the right, so maybe we'll do, let's say 100, 300. Close bracket, again click anywhere in here, and that's actually pretty close, not looking too bad. I think I want it to move up just a touch more, so I'm going to change 300 down to about, say, 275. There we go. I think that looks good for now. Another thing I'll add that you can fix by hand is if you look at the web cone here, as I'm using page up to go backwards, the web cone is no longer connected to our web composition. So the way you can do that is go forward until it's somewhere you like it, right here. Click the web cone and hit P on the keyboard for position. I'm also going to hit Shift S to bring up the scale as well at the same time. Little trick there. And I'm going to click the stopwatch for both of them, move backwards 2 frames, and then move the web cone closer to where I want it, and then scale it down just a touch, maybe about like that. Move back another frame, and it's gone. So if you play this back, that looks pretty good. Now the next thing to do is to roto out the hand and the web shooter at a certain point in time to where this web isn't sticking out on top of it. Fortunately, from the angle it was filmed, you pretty much can just hide the web behind the hand and it will appear as though it's coming out of the fist. The way to do that is to grab your footage, duplicate it, move it to the top of everything. We can turn it off for now. Make sure your top footage is selected and grab the pen tool, and you can roto out the hand here just enough so that way it will be covered. That looks good. Now select the footage and hit M on the keyboard and create a keyframe right here for the mask. And then you'll have to go through the entire length of your composition and adjust further so that way the web is not crossing in front of the hand. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up the footage and do that now. There we go, that looks pretty good to me. So the other thing you can do is hit F on the keyboard to bring up feather, and then turn that up to somewhere pretty small, like 3 or 4 in that range. It's all based on your preference. I think 3 looks pretty good. And with that, our tracking is done. We got the roto and it's looking pretty good. Now we just need our reactive wiggle that you saw in the original example. So the way to do that is, let's go to our first frame here, grab our footage and hit Control C for copy, and go back into our web comp 2, and then hit Control V for paste. Put that below, and just as before, right click and change it to a guide layer, because you just want this there so that you can see what the web is doing in relation to the footage. So I'm going to zoom in here just so I can focus on the web itself, and I'm going to go to the point in time in which it's just finishing its animation. So right here looks good, and I'm going to grab the puppet tool, make sure the web comp is selected, and create a point at the beginning and the end, and then one in about the middle to, further towards the right, not quite the middle. Click Web Comp and hit U on the keyboard to open up the keyframe information for your puppet pins. Now, right here at this point in time, I want the middle to be moved up a little bit, as if it's impacting the wall. So I'm gonna push that up just a tad. And now we can go forward, maybe 2 frames, pull it back down, 2 more frames, back up, 2 more frames back down. And with each frame that you create, the movement should get gradually smaller and smaller, as if the wiggle is slowly working itself out. Once you have something you think looks pretty good like that, you can select your keyframes, and then right-click, Keyframe Assistant, choose Easy Ease. And the cool thing is that this is 100% reactive. Just so I can show you a super dramatic example, if I want to, at this point in time right here, drag this all the way up, we can go back into our original composition and you can see that it has since reacted to what we're doing inside of Web Comp 2. Clearly I don't want it to do that. It needs to be much more subtle of a wiggle, but it helps add realism and keep the project nice and organized. So if you go back here to the original composition after creating this small wiggle, you can see what it is that it's doing right at the point of shooting. It's subtle, but trust me, it goes a long way. Now the last step for these physics is to try and imagine that you're holding a string and you're moving it around similar to how the hand in this is moving around too. Obviously, if you yank it down and then quickly move it back up, the string is going to flex in the middle, creating kind of a downward U shape. So you're going to want to try and recreate that depending upon where the hand is moving. So for example, right here, I quickly move it to the left and then back to the right. So at that point in time, I'm going to create a keyframe here, move forward until the movement to the left has stopped, and then I'm going to force the web kind of up and to the left a little bit, and then just as before, gradually work out the movement. So 2 frames forward, move it back, 2 more frames, back, 2 more again, 2 more again, until we're settled back down to the middle. So if you play this back, okay, cool. Another small issue that you're running into. Look at this cool little line right here that the puppet tool is glitching out and creating. The way to fix that is to turn up the detail that it's calculating into your mesh. So click your web comps down arrow here, Effects, Puppet Tool, Mesh 1, and then we're going to change the expansion up as well as the number of triangles it uses to deform. So essentially what you're just going to want to do is in Web Comp 2, go through and choose places in time where you think the web should wiggle and deform based on the hand's movement, particularly right here at the beginning when the web initially splats into the wall. And create little wiggle movements like that all throughout your composition. And it really helps sell this effect. Once you have the physics looking the way you want, go back into your Web Comp and Web Cone compositions and turn on motion blur for the comp and for element 3D for both of these. It's going to slow down your computer a little bit, which is why I didn't have it on initially, but it's going to help dramatize the speed that the web is coming out at. And we can also go back into our original composition and enhance this a little bit further by turning it on in this composition as well for both of these layers. Oh, and I realize now that I've also forgotten to tell you to make sure that the compositions are starting at the frame that the web would be appearing, which is right here. So anything before that needs to be cut off. So you can hold Shift and select both of these, and then press Alt, open bracket, to trim them up to that point. Now, aside from color correcting this a little bit further, and then adding on the letterbox and the color grade that I did in the original, the last thing that I did was take this Powder Hit 1 from Action Essentials and use it very subtly right when the web is exiting the web shooter. So you can drop that on if you have Action Essentials and hover that in place and time it up so that way it's exploding out, and turn the opacity down really low, somewhere around about 15, and maybe speed it up a touch just so it looks like it's happening smaller than it actually is when it was originally recorded. So that would be time stretch to about 50, and that looks pretty good. So up until this point, my tutorials have pretty much just focused on the creation aspect rather than the actual compositing. And I do that just for the sake of time. So if you guys are interested, I would be happy to create a tutorial going over the techniques I use to composite 3D into live action footage, as well as the simple color correction and color grading techniques I use to make things look cinematic. But with that being said, that just about does it for this tutorial, and as always, please let me know if you have any questions. I would be happy to clarify anything that I didn't explain well enough or that you just need help on. Feel free to let me know if you have any requests for tutorials or anything of that nature. And as always, don't forget to like if you learned something and consider subscribing.